Hello, and welcome back to episode 2 of Service to Savings, the podcast about military finances put on by the Military Financial Advisors Association. I'm Joe. And
I am Greg, and like my friend Joe here, we are both military qualified financial planners with the Military Financial Advisors Association. Looking forward to having another great discussion today.
yes, and so today, Greg, we're going to talk about should I buy a house at my next duty station, which is a question that I hear all the time, and I have so many thoughts on.
Like, this is one of those ones where it's like, where do you start? How do you possibly cover everything? Whether it's, hey, I'm active duty and I'm buying my first time home, or this is a VA loan lender question, or when buying a house versus renting, or what do I do with all these houses now that I've PCS'd more than once and I've collected all of them like Pokemon? There's just so much to talk about. So let's see, where should we start?
Well, maybe if we start with a little bit of a scenario, that'll help us kind of zero in and help people relate or decide which parts of the answer apply to them. So you're former Navy, so let's say you're settling into a new PCS at NAS Pensacola, right? BEA checks are going to start rolling in, right? And you've got a realtor in your ear pitching you this perfect 4-bed colonial. So the question becomes, like, are you going to buy and build equity? Or are you going to rent and keep your options wide open? Let's dissect that, both the math, some of the risks that you're taking on, and how really being deliberate is probably the best thing that you can do. And finally, we all need to realize that if you plan on staying in, you're going to PCS again too, right? So maybe we can crunch some of those numbers and kind of take it from there. You mentioned the VA loan, Greg, so do you want to start talking about that and what it is and if service members should use it?
So the short answer is I love the VA loan. I've used the VA loan. Most of us have. It is really great, but there are risks. And one of the cool things about being in the military is that there are actually so many opportunities. And I feel like every year or every generation that goes on, we really are afforded more and more benefits to the military community. Like, generationally, what I have is not what my grandfather had, my dad had, etc. And the VA loan is one of these really great things because they give you a lot of affordability and they give you a lot of support with underwriting, and they do a lot of the risk protection, right? Like, anybody that's had a VA loan knows that you have to do an inspection and you have to get like a good house. You can't buy a turd or they're not going to let you do it. So like that's actually like some inherent protection, and it's a good thing, even though it might feel like a pain in the butt. But the VA loan is a mortgage concept that says, yeah, obviously Petty Officer Greg is buying a house with this mortgage, and his trustworthiness and lender qualities are certainly important, but the VA is going to also help underwrite that and assume some of that risk on my behalf. And in addition to that, they're going to say, hey, you know what? You don't have to have a down payment. And while that is nice, and maybe that allows me to buy a bigger house, that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, right? And I think,
don't forget, in addition to, you don't need a down payment, but they do charge a funding fee of 2.5% the first time you use it. So if you finance that 100%, right, Greg, and then you add on that 2.5% funding fee and you roll that into the loan too, you're now at 102.5% borrowed on your home, which means you can't sell it and break even anymore.
Well, and if you think about it, like, that's actually a major risk, right? So no down payment doesn't equal no risk. It means that you're 100% financed, and even a 5% market drop can put you underwater, right? Like, we don't want to have to owe more on our house than our house is worth. This isn't a car. For most Americans, it's their single biggest purchase in their life, and funding fees, you're looking at 1.4 to 3 point something, 3.6, which can easily wipe out that early equity that you might have. And in our last episode, what were we talking about? We were talking about emergency funds. Oh, you know what? Home equity is one place where you could tap into and have additional sources of funds in a pinch. So why buy extra risk? Why not actually out the gate own more of your property? Don't get me wrong, I still like VA loans.
Yeah, like, I love the VA loan. The no PMI is great and huge on it. No private mortgage insurance. Benefit. That can save you a massive amount of money over the life of a loan. But on the other side of that, the reality of our life in the military is that every 2 to 4 years, you're probably PCSing to a new location. Well, even in the best of times, that what real estate can appreciate about 3% a year is, what you should plan on. If you are financing that 2.5% in there for the loan, and then you're also, trying to, and then there's a market dip on top of that, that can easily wipe out everything that you get in equity that you've built up in equity across those years, to the point where you may not be able to close on the house, sell the house, without bringing money to the table to be able to get out of it. In fact, I happened to buy up here in New England in 2006, and as anyone in my era, you remember this, Greg, is 2008. Something pretty bad happened with real estate.
Yeah, I graduated college and had to join the real world.
Yes. So beyond that, the real estate took a major dip, right? And
Yep.
and when I went to sell in 2014, which was 6 years later, I still had to bring a little bit of money to closing to be able to get out of that house. Now, since then, everything has worked out great. I've bought a new house, but you could see that how that could be devastating. And I got to delay that sale by 6 years. If I would have had to sell in 2009, I mean, I know people in the military who had to declare bankruptcy because of that. It was not a good situation all around.
Yeah. Just, I guess, revisiting the VA loan again. So it is this great mortgage program specifically for veterans and military service members. Some things that I want to caution you. So there's this thing called like the VA reuse myth, Joe, and people interpret it a lot of different ways. I just want to put some quick talking points out there. You can, in fact, use the VA loan multiple times, but there's catches, right? Like you can't reuse it if your entitlement is still tied up to another property. Additionally, the other thing to consider is like, hey, each time I reuse it, the funding fee stacks up unless you're like exempt for like disability reasons. So
Yep.
even though you can use it multiple times, which, it's nice to have that support by the VA, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like there aren't costs associated, and we should always be intentional with the costs. Like, so we talked about intentionality with emergency funds, and when we're buying a house, it should be intentional. I have one family, they just retired from the Navy, and early in their career, like the first time they were stationed up here in New England, and we'll just pretend that they got PCS down to Pensacola or Norfolk or something like that, they had bought this house, and their hope was, well, we hope that we get back there someday. That's why they kept it. And not so much because they viewed it as an asset or something that they could turn into rental income. They viewed it as something that they were going to buy and have as a gathering place for future generations. You know what I mean? So there's some really great reasons to buy, even if you know you're moving, but there's also some risks. I have a chief that I've worked with that got his PCS orders to his next duty station, and he had two crossroads to choose. He can either become a senior chief and possibly get new orders, or go warrant and definitely have to move back to where he just PCS'd from. But now he bought a house. What do you do there? Sell your house and hope you can buy the one you just sold? Sell the house you just bought to buy the one you just sold, right?
Yeah.
So even though we have this great VA tool, should we even be rushing to buy every time we move?
And really, there's a couple things that I like to think about, or ways I structure this when I think about, is buying a good idea. So the first one is, taking a prediction of how long do I expect to be in the area, right? 4 years is kind of where my decision point starts to waver, but less than 4 years, it almost needs to be a home that I plan on renting or coming back to get, because the chances of you breaking even across 4 years is pretty slim. Generally speaking, closing costs, both on the front end and the back end, so buying and selling, is going to add up in totals to somewhere between 10 and 16% of the cost of the home. So if you figure that 3% equity a year means that your 4 years is where you're kind of like, okay, I'm pretty sure I'm going to at least break even. 5 years is really even safer than that. And so if it's less than that, I start to lean heavily towards, I'm either going to be a landlord or I'm going to not rent and not buy. Right. After that, then I start to go, okay, am I going to use VA or am I going to use a traditional loan? If you're putting down less than 20%, almost always wins out as the better factor. And so then you start to go, okay, I don't want to be negative equity. Can I put that 2.5% or whatever the funding fee is down on the loan?
Mm-hmm.
And then finally is kind of that am I buying emotionally? I need a place that's safe for my kids and my wife, and that's what's driving me to it. Or am I making a good financial decision? Is the last one that I really went to, because I tend to find that when I start to make those emotional decisions and being forced into decisions, right? Like we need to find a place to live right now. That's when I tend to start to make more detrimental decisions, and so not making sure that I'm not being forced and because if I start to feel that way, then I start to again lean more towards renting because I can change that decision pretty easy, right? Buying is
Right.
almost impossible.
It's easy to do, but we really need to try not to overlook the emotional aspect of this. As a planner, I lean heavily into values and by an extension emotions and the sense of security and the access to good schools in a very specific zip code, right? There are a ton of reasons that your emotions should be part of this, right? However, we do need to acknowledge that emotional purchases rarely outperform disciplined financial ones, and none of us are immune, right? Like, it doesn't matter how much of a nerd you are. Like, let's pick
Yep.
the nerdiest nuke, Dungeons and Dragons player. I'm from the nuclear community, so I just expect that everybody else is also a nerd. But it is really easy to fall into this trap if all of a sudden your entire unit, everybody just bought houses around you, right? You're going to have this
Yeah.
anchoring bias, and you're going to assume that rent is wasted money. That's one of the catchphrases that I hear all the time. It's like, oh, I don't want to rent. Like, I'm just giving money to somebody else. And I'm like, that may be. I mean, especially if you very intentionally want to create a real estate portfolio. On one hand, I love real estate portfolios, especially it's so easy to do in your military because you're naturally
Yep.
inclined to move. I think it's like 70% is every 2 to 3 years we move.
Right.
If we're inclined to move, now we have these opportunities where we're already doing research in a particular geographic area each time. Um, that gives us the opportunity to create a passive income stream. At this other hand of that mathematical equation is you have to factor in vacancy rates and maintenance costs and all of these hidden expenses that come with owning a home when renting has some very nice advantages. You're not tied to a spot. You were on icebreakers, right, Joe?
I was
So that means you were out to sea literally every other
six
six
months.
months or something like that.
Yep. Yeah.
So why would I ever want to own a house? Like, I would rather pay 6 months of rent than put my stuff in long term storage or something than,
Right.
bank it. But I think you can argue the other side of that coin too, couldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, you can, if you were doing something like that, you could house hack, right? Which is another popular thing with this. So if you're young, single, right, you buy the house, you rent out the rooms in the house, usually to fellow service members, and then that they pay essentially your mortgage. You can end up great on that. It's just you're taking on extra risk. And so, going back to the previous episode with emergency funds, that means in general, like you're going to want some extra money in that emergency fund because you're taking on extra risk. Because what happens if half the rooms are vacant, or what happens if the roof leaks? So you want to think about those things and make sure that you're prepared for that risk and that you're not over leveraging yourself, right? Because people always think, oh, I can make a lot of money on a house. Well, the reason that it seems like relatively you're making a lot of money on a house is because you're highly leveraged, meaning that the resources that you put into it are much lower than the value of the asset that you're purchasing. And so that leverage is where you make that extra money on it because, if you buy a $400,000 house and it goes up 3%, of course, that's much higher than putting the $10,000 you have in the bank into the stock market and it going up 8%, right? Even
Yeah.
even though it went up more than double, you still
Law
made
of
a
big numbers.
what?
The law of big numbers.
Yeah, the law of big numbers, right? But the problem is with those law of big numbers, there's a downside risk that people often emotionally just don't process and take into account. So you want to make sure that you're ready for that. Um, there were two words in your answer, Greg, that I really liked. One was intentional. Be really intentional with this decision. Do I plan on being a landlord? Do I not be planning on being a landlord? And how does that go? And then, the other one was the emotional aspect of it, right? Often people get attached to houses that they live in. and it becomes an emotional decision. And we just need to both acknowledge it and then figure out how we're going to account for it in the math that we're doing when it comes time.
Well, I literally, yeah, that emotional decision is really powerful. I have a couple that I serve that are down in Colombia, and they're going to be PCSing in 2026. And they're like, well, do we sell this house or can we keep this house? Like, do we buy the next house? They love their home and they spend so much energy turning in their home. They love their neighbors. They want to come back to it, or they want this, like, to preserve this asset. I mean, that's a pretty good reason to buy. That's a pretty good reason to hold, even though you're
Yep.
becoming an accidental landlord, right? And the trouble with a lot of these buying decisions is that you're still playing like real estate roulette. You never know what the market, just because like most of our data is like national data, like, oh, houses are up or there's no inventory or interest rates are changing the thing. But if you were to look at like Tampa, so Dill Air Force Base, or San Diego, right, those are up 6 to 8% year over year. But then if you look at like Minot or Fort Sill, they've been flat or negative. So you're not promised 3% appreciation, right, Joe? So you got to make those decisions, and they can't be in a vacuum.
Great points on the emotional decision, Greg. And I think, there is math behind it, and we can do the math and figure out whether it works out. But that's really only half the decision, because at the end of the day, if you can't, bring yourself to make that decision, that's where, it doesn't matter how good the math is, the emotional side ends up taking over. So it needs to be both on right front.
Speaking of emotionals, are you familiar with the BAH trap?
I am not. Let's go
So
ahead and take us through that.
there's this emotional, like I associate with emotional. Maybe it's more behavioral finance than anything else. But I wrote this note, knowing that we were going to talk, that we have this really bad habit of tying our purchasing power directly to our BAH, right? Like I absolutely certainly believe that BAH for most people, especially on the junior tiers, that should be your upper bounds, is like, hey, your mortgage or your rent probably shouldn't exceed BAH, because then you lose the options to do everything else like live or invest
Yep.
or explore, experience port calls, all that stuff with all the other money. But BAH isn't just a green light to go buy the biggest house on Zillow. It's a tool, not a target. And realtors often overstate that affordability. Yes, it's tax free. Like we love that benefit on our LES. And lenders see it and they're like, oh, we'll approve higher mortgages. But that doesn't mean it actually fits your budget or lifestyle. So if we go and buy up to our BAH and possibly shortchange savings or debt payoff or setting aside money for our next move or kids' braces or whatever, I mean, I guess braces is a bad example with our benefits, but you end up in being house poor, right? Like, so it might feel great to buy this house of your dreams, but what if you can't afford anything else after that? Like it almost like ruins the experience.
Well, and not only that, but your dream today is probably not going to be your dream tomorrow. So,
Mm-hmm.
you may end up ruining the experience today and by extension, ruining the experience tomorrow because you got yourself into a situation that is maybe impossible or very difficult to get out of. The other thing, yes, Greg, speaking of BAH, one thing that I think a lot of people don't take into account is BAH is supposed to pay your rent and your utilities. And so it's not just your rent. And now 95% of your rent and utilities, but still, if you can get your rent and utilities under your BAH, it often is going to help keep you from being house poor. That can be difficult with a mortgage, right? But you want to
Mm-hmm.
try and still shoot for that if you can on getting that, living a little bit more modestly now, enable you to do more later. One thing that I also like to remind people of, especially when they're going to look at buying, is that your mortgage is the least you'll pay in any given month, while your rent is the most you'll pay in any given month. And so, part of what you're paying with your rent is that you've transferred the risk to the landlord, right? If the air conditioner breaks, I don't know any renters that are going to go fix the air conditioner for the landlord and pay to do it, right? But if you own the house, it's on you. So, keeping that in mind is, something to just really to make sure that you're understanding. And that goes for other things like regular maintenance on the house and mowing the
Mm-hmm.
lawn and a whole bunch of other things that you don't think about but are necessary when you buy a house.
Absolutely.
And so, did you have
Yeah.
any other thoughts on buying a house, or before we?
No, I just think it's important for us to state the values and the math, you should put the values first to start the decision. It's like having an overarch strategy, and then the math is the tactics, right?
Yeah.
Like, obviously the values don't work if the math doesn't work. Like, I might value a Bentley, but I can't afford it. But you should still be leaning with why is this an important purchase for me? Okay, now let's make this math work. Because at the end of the day, maybe it's just me, but I think the math is the easy part. So do the heavy lifting first. Maybe talk about how, like, so in our brief technical gap there, I was talking about like tying this back into a planning lens of financial readiness. Like, what does your decision structure look like? Mission, resources, risk, etc. How would you approach that?
Yeah, so I often look at it as and this, when you decide to buy a house, it's a decision that you and your spouse need to make together, or you and your support network need to make together, because there is a lot of ongoing maintenance and jobs that come with owning the house, and you don't just get to call someone up and say, hey, this broke or this is wrong, come fix it. And if you're not able or there, or your spouse or your support network isn't able or there to take care of those items, then that can end up causing you a lot of issues at the end of the day, because when something goes wrong, someone's going to have to take care of it with the house, or you have this massive asset that is probably most of your net worth tied up in, and you're letting it degrade over time because you're not doing the upkeep that's necessary to.
Right. Yep, go ahead.
And it scares me, honestly, to be on the other side of the world, while you have a house, and no one that you trust being close to it to be able to look in on it, right?
So just because I'm a rosy, optimistic kind of guy, I did value, our military community for that, because you often do develop all of these friends in the communities that we belong to, whether it's submarines or the surface warfare officers, etc., where the Coast Guard Academy people, where maybe like there is that proximity where, yeah, I moved, but somebody might still be back there, or one of my buddies had overlapped, and now they're at my old command, where there is that chance where they could actually step in and help you in a lot of ways. I had a buddy that when he was transferring off of a carrier out in San Diego to come back to Groton.
Yep.
First off, the crazy thing is they bought a house unseen, sight unseen, which blew my mind. But once they made this purchase to get everything ready, they actually had several of our local friends there kind of already getting the house kind of set up and prepared and making things were good for when they moved. And the spouse and children actually moved ahead of the service member just because of orders and timing and stuff like that. So we do have this awesome support network. So leaning into your network is always encouraged, especially if you take the time to develop a really good one. One thing I didn't acknowledge, because I kind of beat up a lot buying houses this conversation, there are some pretty cool advantages that do come to buying houses, right? Like I can borrow against it, right? I mentioned home equity loans earlier. If I sell or buy a house, like there's DoD has a reimbursement program where you could get to, I think it's like up to $15,000 was the note I made for qualifying moves that people often overlook. And then from a tax perspective, if you're married filing jointly and I sell a home, I'm always asked, like, well, what happens if I sell my home? Like, what am I going to pay in taxes? Well, if you own and live in the home for 2 or 5 years, I can exclude up to $500,000 of those gains. So like I paid something and then it grew, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean,
and now I don't have to worry about that growth biting me in the butt.
That is super valuable, right? Some of those tax advantages and equity advantages are great. And I have known people that have built their real estate empire and ended up doing very well out of it. I also know some people that have gotten burned by it. And so, going back to, that word earlier that you used, intentional. And I think that's really what you just need to be with it, is intentional. Yes, I want to be a landlord, or no, I do not want to be a landlord. And then that starts to give you some parameters around your decision to buy or not buy. I don't want to be a landlord. I'm only going to be stationed there for 2 years. Okay. We're leaning towards not buying automatically right now. I want to be a landlord, and it's a great real estate market that no one ever sees going away, which often happens for those of us stationed on the coast, right? And so then you start to go, okay, like, yeah, like I may want to buy and continue on being a landlord after I move. So, but those are intentional decisions, and I think that's the important thing.
And my last thought on that, especially like because we're talking about intentionality, like And I've even heard cadets say, yeah, I have no intention that I'm going to live here or there, but I want to buy houses. I want to create a real estate portfolio. That's not necessarily me for me, but it could be a great idea. And if you know going into it that I'm creating a string of investments, you have to think about the properties like investments. You can't
Right.
think of it like a home. And in my own household, here's the example. We had a property that we still own. We decided that we were going to turn to a rental property. When we moved out, we grew out of this home, buy a bigger house. And I'm like, well, I'm so busy. I can't be a landlord right now. But my wife had an emotional attachment to this property. Like, it was hers and ours. And we were there for so long. Like, so selling it wasn't an option. So now we have a property. We're landlords. But in terms of like paint schemes and design and replacing stuff, like, we don't live there anymore. You need to think of this as an asset,
Right.
a income producing asset. This is a tool for us. This isn't your home anymore.
Yep.
Like, you actually need to think of it as a business, which I think a lot of people aren't accustomed to. Like, we're accustomed to living in something and treating it like a house or a home. Now you need to think of this as a business.
And that is a hard mind shift set for a lot of people. But if you can do it, you can be highly successful doing it. One of my podcasts that I listen to often is called Military Millionaire. He really talks about property and leveraging real estate to essentially become a millionaire, and how he did it. And for those people who that's their path, that is a great path. And you can find some advisors who specialize in helping those people, and really know the ins and outs of that type of planning, and that is a great path to go down. But again, it's about being intentional to go down that path. So
obviously, if anybody has questions about real estate or VA loans or BAH, etc., like, subscribe, throw it in the comments. We would love to keep talking about this. There's just, if you did a search on this, questions are all over the place on buying a house versus investing in retirement funds versus what banks to use, or do I use my VA loan or not? Like, can I take a loan from my TSP to buy a house? Like, this is an endless conversation. So if you have specific questions, Joe and I would love to answer them. Please share them with us.
Yep. So again, leave those questions in the comments below, and we'll be sure to answer them in future episodes. And with that, build wealth with confidence using strategies crafted for military life from the Military Financial Advisors Association. You can find free resources for service members, military spouses, and veterans at militaryfinancialadvisors.org. As your military career grows and success brings complexity, whether managing the BRS, retirement system, PCS transitions, or tax-free pay, work with an MFAA advisor to navigate that complexity. Visit militaryfinancialadvisors.org to get started. Thanks for listening, and catch you next episode.
The information provided on Service to Savings, the Military Financial Advisors Association's podcast, is for general, informational, and educational purposes only. Nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as financial, investment, legal, or tax advice, nor is it intended to be an endorsement or recommendation of any specific product, service, or investment strategy. Always consult with a certified financial planning professional, preferably an MFAA member, before making any financial decisions, as your personal circumstances, including military benefits, TSP contributions, deployment-related finances, or retirement planning may require tailored advice.